Thanks to all the speakers. I thought it was a really terrific session. Lots of great information, lots of different viewpoints, and again, how they all work together and stuff. But I did want to start with a question that is, you all addressed it in some way, but let's talk about how we make this real. So from your experience, without, of course, passing on anything that's confidential and stuff, what have you seen when you're working with your customers? What's actually out in the industry? Like, what is really hot and topic of the mind? I mean, you addressed it in some fashion, but if you can give us some specific, in a general sense, examples of what's on your customers' minds. Where are you seeing, in particular, the things that they are finding that are problematic for security right now as they work with their medical devices in trying to get them to market?
I'll say for the customers that we've been working with, one of the biggest challenges that we see is the question of, I know I need security. I don't know what I need to implement for security. So you can add layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. What they're really asking for is, what do they need for their specific product? And so a lot of times that's helping them understand what are the threats they should be worried about so that they can then define the requirements that are implemented. Some of this is part of those software security development life cycles. They may or may not have a robust architecture, but that's put in place already. Ideally, you do it from starting with a TARA of your system design to identify what those potential threats and attacks might be, and then that becomes your requirements of what you actually implement in your device. That's not typically done that way, though. It's often done in parallel or after the design. You're going back and doing the TAR and then saying, okay, what can I add in now to provide that security? So that's the challenge that they often face. I think one of the ways to address that is to define kind of a basic cybersecurity requirements around, here's the minimum that every design should have in your system. For secure over-the-air updates, it's clearly called for in the guidance. You're going to need those. Secure boot, you're going to need those. Looking at that baseline for the implementation as a starting point, and then using the threat and risk assessment to define the next level of requirements. So that's the biggest challenge that we've seen with the customers we're working with.
On our end, it's two things, right? So one pattern is for new features of existing devices. So think about patient monitors. Now think about patient monitors becoming mobile, right? So now suddenly those devices are in transit and they are exposed, right? So how do we secure that? Think about surgical robots, but now telesurgery, right? So now there's more threats. As features get added, there's more attack vectors, and how we can help them. The other one is for existing designs, how can they integrate security without causing too much latency and throughput, right? And then they really look for that fine-grained control that we can provide. Okay, we're going to specify that patient ID topic, and that's the one we're going to encrypt. Or are we going to only allow the access control from this technician, right? So things of that nature, so they're looking for. So those are two main patterns.
So there was a Secretary of Defense that was quoted, and I won't quote him completely because I don't remember the exact quote, but he talked about the known knowns and the unknown knowns, or the known unknowns. But then there are the unknown unknowns. And that really gets to the key here. A lot of our customers don't fully understand how to do systems securely. And if you think about the different graduate programs that are in universities, how many are centered on cybersecurity? So hiring just engineers that understand this flow, it's an unknown unknown. And so they're coming to us saying, how do we do this? How can we come alongside? How can we train? And a lot of times we'll train our customers in how to build systems securely and bring that training in that maybe they didn't get when they were in college.
This is all pretty new within the last 10 years. So even if you've gone through all these steps, how do you organize it and present it to the FDA? How much or how little do you want to show? And what the best way to do that is? And the FDA does a good job of, actually, they kind of say you need to do this, and then they send you off with appendices, but a lot of our customers are having a hard time figuring out exactly what that really means.
Many in the industry have been encouraging the software bill of materials, SBOM, to make cybersecurity less bolt-on and more part of the design process. So how does that happen in real life? How does that happen in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, and part of this is obviously the need to have the SBOM in the first place. There are different ways of generating that SBOM. If you have an in-house team doing your full engineering and development effort, you could utilize techniques that will generate the SBOM as part of the build process. So making that just a standard practice. Once you have the SBOM, there are tools that then will enable scanning your SBOM on a daily basis to look for the new vulnerabilities that are coming that you can automatically get flagged. So it doesn't have to be an active one of someone has to manually go do the scanning. You can automate that scanning so you can immediately get reports anytime a new CVE affects any of the pieces of software that are in your design. If you have more complicated build process, or you're dealing with suppliers where you may not have full access to the source of the software bill of materials, you then have the capabilities of doing scanning, or you're using pre-compiled libraries, doing the binary scanning to be able to identify it from the binary itself. That similarly gives you an SBOM. So making that part of the standard development lifecycle, there are tools. It takes a little bit of effort to put together, but it's not that complicated to put that into your build process. And that's going to give you probably some of the quickest alerts of your system indicating if there's been a vulnerability found in any of the software that you have. Primarily, this is focused on the third-party open source software that you might be utilizing within your design.
Yeah, and I'll add to that doing a binary scan, the capability to pull that data out, get the official SBOM that could be submitted, but then taking that same data, querying the NIST database for common vulnerabilities, and giving you a punch list of things to fix. So now you've got your priority list. The critical ones, obviously, let's do those before some of the moderate ones. But I mean, it's a list of things to fix before you release. Now, maybe there's 1,000. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't fix 1,000. But maybe I can fix 100 and get that done. And maybe that's the bulk of your critical ones. But you know, now those things are uncovered. Being able to identify what's there in your system from the open source, and then using that NIST database to come back. And I'd say the other thing, and I think you mentioned a little bit, putting it in your continuous integration and development flow. So as you can put it as a stage to automatically run a scan when people check in or when you get to major milestones. We're going to automatically scan. Because when you discover these 1,000 defects or common vulnerabilities, you discover them, and I'm supposed to release next week, that's too late. But if I start, and I know I'm going to release in 2 years, and I know there's 1,000 common vulnerabilities today, but I have 2 years to fix them, now that's a solvable problem. So making sure that you put it into a regular flow in your continuous integration.
The first SBOM I did was manual, which is the wrong way to do it. What these people have pointed out, that you want it automated, and even extending beyond cybersecurity, one big advantage of SBOM is legal. SBOMs often include the license used. Wouldn't it be, you should be aware if some developer snuck in some GPL code, that could have bad effects. And an SBOM contains that information too, which can protect against those sort of things.
So one more of the previously submitted, and then we'll go to some live questions. One is, can you discuss the details of the extra rigor that the FDA is imposing for cybersecurity controls for the SAMD and SIMD, that's software as a medical device and software in a medical device?
Cybersecurity is a hot topic at the FDA. Doesn't matter if it's SAMD or SAMD, software as a medical device, or software in a medical device. I think that they both incur the same amount of rigor, and I think that's been, the details have been talked about through almost all the talks today of kind of what they're trying to figure out.
For something that's a software as a medical device, it's going to just go and analyze, let's say, some images, let's say, detect a tumor, right, versus a software inside a device like a DFAB or something like that, right? So if you think about a CIA framework, right, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, if a software is in the device, you have to think through all those three things. But if it's a software as a medical device, you may not need to worry as much about availability, right? But you still need to worry about confidentiality, right? You need to have the right people be able to access it, and you need to make sure data is valid, right? You still have to think about integrity. It's just that, just concurring in detail.
One of the things that you guys have not talked about today is FDA requirements around labeling for cybersecurity, which is kind of a big deal with the newest guidance. Have you had that experience, and how are you kind of navigating that new space around just labeling requirements for cybersecurity?
That is one of the I think the FDA spells out like a couple dozen
There's
things.
like 17 of them.
Yes, yes. I usually recommend it be a chapter in the IFU that you're going to have, and it's really, instead of being geared towards a clinician, it's almost geared to like the IT manager. And there's some things that you could omit from there. I haven't always included everything because I think once you include like the SBOM, which you can kind of say is a reference document, but I would include as much as you can and as much as relevant to the device. I think the important things are the port traffic in and out is one of the things to include in kind of general operating use. But in general, it can be a pamphlet or just included as a chapter in the IFU.
So I was going to add to that, one of the things, so I actually spoke to the lead, Matt Hazlett at FDA, and we met about the SBOM requirements as part of the labeling documentation, and I had huge concerns around the risk that that poses to the organization, right? Like, you don't want to expose the SBOM to end users. My mom's not going to know the first thing about that, right? If you were to put that in your IFU, my mom would call me and say, well, what does this mean? Mom, ignore it, right? So what we were advised on is that you have to have a means in which to obtain that SBOM. So ultimately what FDA is saying is that you should have a way to either have people log in to like your website to pull that SBOM down, or a means in which to request that information. And so that's what we're doing for clients that we work with, is providing that education and awareness. Same thing with forensic data. I had to ask about that too for labeling, because I was like, well, you're really exposing organizations if you expect that to be highlighted in your labeling documentation. What is your stance on that? And the outtake of that was, you just need to be able to present what data or what information that you are tracking or capturing for your end users. We don't expect you to put in all of these details. And so it's interesting to see kind of how they're navigating it and how other people in this industry are providing guidance around those topics. So I was interested in your take there.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword when you publish an SBOM. And I know that there's been some vulnerabilities that have, they want to be published right away, but then the software that's affected, they want to give them time to fix it first. If companies aren't right on that, and that gets published, then that's actually a vulnerability that somebody could exploit. So you have to be careful what data gets out there and who goes to. And to your point, your mom doesn't need to know that.
Right.
But some of the people that are interacting with the device, maybe they're IT professionals in the hospital, they may want to know, oh, there's a vulnerability that's been addressed here, and it needs to get flagged. And then we can ask the medical provider, have they implemented a fix? Have you updated your SBOM so that now it's excluded? Or should I take that device off the network? So there's actionable data that needs to be published, but to the right people.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to view it. It's who are the right people who are using the SBOMs. These are the administrators of the devices that want to have the early warning of, oh, I saw a vulnerability, and now I want to look for, does that affect my device? They may see that from a news article or an industry group like the Health ISAC who's reporting on attacks that they're seeing. That might be the first source of knowledge where they're looking for an attack, and they have to determine, does that affect the devices I have? And that's where the SBOM would be important for them to be able to look at that. But it's not an end user who's going to care about, my mom is not going to read an SBOM.
Right.
She wouldn't know what to do with that. Not everybody needs to do that. So it's about getting the right data to the right people, and I think what the FDA is looking for in their requirements is saying, we're going to put the requirement in there, so if the right people need it, you're required to provide it to them in that format. Not that you have to make it publicly accessible to every single person who might be utilizing that device.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Roman defined a cyber device as a device that's got network connectivity. What about medical devices that don't have network connectivity? Do they have the same requirements?
Whether the FDA requires it, I think, was a slightly different topic. I think any device that potentially stores, let's say, patient data, having some security around that device, even if it's not network connected, could still be a challenge. You do have physical attacks. They're less likely to happen because they require someone to be physically there with the device to be able to do an attack on it. I wouldn't say that they're unheard of. So some level of security, but that level of security would be different from a network-connected device. Likely why it's focused on the network-connected devices is those pose a much bigger threat. And the network or the internet-connected devices in particular, that actually gives you the ability to support those over-the-air updates. So a lot of those requirements around being able to update your firmware is under the assumption it's on the network, so there should be a way for you to update that over the network in a secure way to address those vulnerabilities. So it's kind of just drawing a bubble around that requirement there. I don't think a non-network device gets a pass entirely, from my opinion. I think it should need it, but the controls you need on it would be different.
I can add to that from an old system experience. Like the way I was trained is for security, assume it's broken, right, when you're architecting a safe system, right? So it includes the USB port, USB drives coming in. As Roman said, it's not as stringent if it's networked, but you still have to think about it, right? So what if it gets broken? You cannot assume that it never will get compromised. So at that, you have to go through that risk analysis and make sure you have enough coverage, all right? And not just old-style liability coverage. Hopefully there's some some actual isolation and technology so that that cannot corrupt any safe operation of that device.
And just because we build a device that's not on the network doesn't mean that there's not a hidden connector inside the box for debug, JTAG, or maybe they pulled the Ethernet controller is still on the board, but they pulled the connector. Oh, that's good enough. Nobody's going to hook it up, but anybody that wants to could go in and reconnect those ports. Now I have access. What can I do with it? And could I do anything nefarious? Now, it can't become a denial of service attack. It's not connected. But can it gain any information? Can you glean anything about it? And maybe this device is not connected, but the next generation device is, and it's using 90% the same software. So I could learn a lot here and then deploy my attack on the next generation device. So I think it still needs to be thought in your TARA as you're looking at your threat analysis and risk assessment as you're going through those to say, what if? What am I doing to prevent anybody from getting access? And then even putting tamper-proof. If the connector's inside, as soon as you open the package, if I detect that, I could zero out the memory and make it null and void. They can't do anything with the data.
April 22 guidance makes it, FDA makes it clear that the level of effort should be proportional to the risk. So not having it connected will greatly reduce the risks, but as everyone else has said, it doesn't give you a pass. So you're going to be in for a bad time with the FDA if you submit no cybersecurity documentation, but you can probably argue that not all of it is required.
While medical devices can be secure on their own, what additional security stopgaps should be considered once added to a buyer's environment or networks?
When you have a device and it's I'll call it security hardened on its own, so you've done all that you can there. But once you put it on a network, I call that the Wild West. You're out there, you have no idea what else is on that network and who's listening and what's going on. So you have to assume that the communications can be monitored. You have to assume that somebody's collecting that data. Maybe they can't do anything with that data if you've truly put in all the corrections for today. But one of the questions that I'm being asked for long-term devices, we've put in certain security protocols today. We put in encryption keys. And somebody collects that data today. We can't understand that data today, but roll the clock forward 5 years. So instead of it being 2023, it's 2028. Now with quantum compute, we can decode that data. It's stale, it's 5 years old. Is it valuable? Is there anything we can do with it? What are we protecting? So I think actually looking at the future of devices and how that data that could be today captured, is it something that could actually be an attack surface in the future? And think about your banking records. They're available today. The encryption that you access to them today with quantum compute, are those same algorithms going to break in 5 years with quantum compute? And now somebody can get access to your bank records, whatever was transferred, because they can get into the machine. So you have to look at this whole system holistically, not just the individual system, harden it, but have the software over-the-air update so you can update it, and then plan for the future for new technologies like quantum compute and how that's going to affect your security, there's a special word, I forget the word, but your security positioning and how you positioned your product and where you can improve that.
Yeah, and I think this comes into also the intended life cycle of your product. How long do you think that product will be in the field? If it's a product that's only out there for 5 years, quantum is not likely something that you would worry about. And we don't know exactly when quantum computers will get that fast. It could be 5, it could be as long as 15. So it is planning that ahead. So if you have a device you expect to be used for 20 years, you should be worried about, or thinking about, not worried, thinking about quantum computing and how it might affect your device and making your devices secure right now. So that would be if you're using an RSA asymmetric algorithm, use the biggest key size that's available for that, because that'll give you the best resistance against your quantum attacks. That's how you can start thinking about that. In terms of to the question of what kind of stopgaps can you do now if you have a secure device that you now connect to the network, I would say if you have a secure device that wasn't connected to the network, it's a different device than the version that you've connected to the network, because you've added now in a lot of software that will communicate over the network. You've opened up new attack vectors. So that aspect of your system, that needs the proper security control. So it's really focusing on there's additional security controls you absolutely need if you have a previously unconnected device and you've added some level of network connectivity to it. And you have to think about what security is needed there.
Somebody had submitted the question of, please explain how to assess cybersecurity risk probability in risk management activities.
I think there's guidance on specific factors for cybersecurity risk. If you're familiar with the regulatory people, like the 14971 for like clinical risk, where you have a kind of a severity and probability. The 14971 defines that for clinical. I believe there's a standard that defines that for cybersecurity as well. It's the same approach where you would assign the pre-mitigated risk and the post-mitigated risk based on a 5-point scale, I think, in both severity and probability.
Yeah, and I think that's the point. It's not trying to put a specific number of this attack is 10% chance of happening. It's more about having those levels. Is this a low risk? Is this a medium risk? Is this a very high risk? And then that's often used in combination with what's the impact of that particular threat scenario that you're looking at. So something with a very high impact and a very high probability of attack, that's absolutely something you need to consider mitigating. If it's a very low probability and a very low impact, then that might be something that you doesn't need to mitigate it, or to mitigate it in a very different way, a light way, maybe through human processes to address it if it ever happens. So it's really the scale of doing that and how do you assess the risk then comes back into, well, how do you get to those categories? So there are different frameworks for how you determine between a low and a high, but it usually relates to analyzing, thinking through the process of, okay, what expertise is needed to do this attack? Could a layperson with no knowledge follow a tutorial and do it? That's a low skill attack. Or do you need sophisticated equipment and a large team of researchers to be able to do that attack? That's going to be a very low probability of attack, just because of the expertise and the equipment and the resources and the time required to do that. So that's how a lot of those factors come into thinking through what the risks are, to then identify those levels of the risk that you're looking at.
what you're describing is essentially a threat modeling framework. And I was wondering if you could give some recommendations about threat modeling frameworks that are out there, like the AMI Tier 57 compared to the OWASP or so. Is that something that you specifically like for medical devices?
That's a good question. There are a lot of frameworks out there, and that's part of the challenge. Stride is a very common and well understood one that people frequently use. I don't know offhand myself of one that's specifically targeting medical devices. I know of frameworks that have been developed that are specific in other areas, such as automotive. There's some guidelines that come out of an automotive standard that have sort of a framework that's defined on how to do a Terra for automotive systems. I haven't seen anything similar to that to medical devices, and the use case of medical devices are different enough. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a need to develop such of a standard or kind of customization for it. So I would say the existing ones that are out there, I don't have a particular recommendation other than the well-established ones that you find out there. Stride's a very common one that people utilize.
That uses Stride. I know the FDA does cite TIR 57 as one to go into and use, but ironically that's not in their list of accepted standards if you look up the one, so there.
But I was wondering, they now recommend the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and that's super complicated, and I'm wondering whether that actually makes any sense. Because a lot of it is very much targeted towards web-based applications and mobile applications. It does simply not apply.
Yeah, I think there are differences from CVSS. CVSS is good for scoring a vulnerability that's known, and that could be part of your threat assessment, but it's not the complete threat assessment framework. That's just the scoring you provide around a vulnerability. So it might be a small piece of that, but it's not the overall TARA framework that you would want to follow for doing your assessment.
I would recommend against using the CVSS score. I think you have to do it when submitting it, but it's so formulaic that I often, more times than not, I find myself justifying the risk way down from what what the formula gives you. That I'm often shocked by the CVSS score. It's something that I think is a pretty innocuous bug, but then I look at the risk and it ends up being, patient death imminent. Whoa, how do we get there? And I'm like, no, for our device, it's not that bad.
Just trying to wrap my head around all these new requirements. So FDA has a new guidance, and now EU is coming up with something. And we also have the UL 2100 and the IEC 62304. So it's getting a little overwhelming. Is there something that ties all this together and makes it easy for medical device companies to implement?
I think with the EU and US standards, there's a lot of overlap. If you've done it, you've done ISO 14 or 13485 and the 21 CFR Part 820. Most of that is 95% the same, and like the ISO 81001 is very as closely related to the FDA's 2022 guidance as some of those other, like the human factors engineering. But you brought up a few different things, like the 62304 is more about software engineering. And there, what 81001, I'm still getting used to that one, tries to do is tie that, it builds on top of the 62304 in a way that it's the medical version of the total product lifecycle or secure product development framework. So it tries to kind of add on cybersecurity, if you will, to 62304.
So are they going to make it like a harmonized standard at some point?
EU's set to harmonize 81001 next year. That's the plan.
Great. Thank you.
And I would just add to that it's great that there's standards. There's so many to choose from. The question is which one is the right one for you. And I see it because we're cross-domain. So we have medical, we have industrial, we have aerospace and defense, there's vehicles. And so as you look at all these things, how do you, so I'm looking at both from a safety and a security perspective, how do you address all these markets? And you kind of have to focus because of the different standards and because they're asking for different things. The goal is the same, but the information and the level that you need to go to is different. So I would say go to a trusted advisor that's gone through some of these standards and then say, well, what's appropriate for your device? And then follow that.
I wanted to elaborate on the CVSS, which I also hate the use of CVSS, and I have questioned it because I find it to be this hypothetical kind of pretend land guessing situation when we come to scoring vulnerabilities that aren't in real world products yet. But I wanted to talk, or at least add on to it a little bit just in my experience, is that, and I think you really just, Stephen, right? You really just hit the nail on the head, is that it's a business decision. Whatever methodology you're using, whatever scoring framework you have for device submissions, it needs to be based on your business, right? What makes sense for your business, and choose that methodology. So if you don't want to use CVSS scoring, while FDA recommends it, you don't have to use it, but you have to have a well-defined, articulated scoring methodology within your documentation. That's what they're looking for. STRIDE is actually the most commonly recognized threat modeling methodology in software, so I think that's why it resonates well with the FDA. You can use any methodology. They don't care, they just want to know that you have a framework and that you're using it. So I deal with this a lot because we do consulting, and so I've touched a ton of different medical devices, and I think it's important to get that message out, that you don't have to pick one framework or one methodology, just make sure that it's well articulated in your documentation.
We had a customer, there's a CALIC is one of the CVEs that came out about a year ago, and we had to address it in our software base. CALIC, it's a way of allocating memory in your system, and it takes two integers and it returns an integer. The problem there is those two integers it takes, it multiplies them together. What's the object, and what's the size of the object, and how many of those objects do you want to allocate? And if you take an integer and you multiply an integer, you might overflow. So how do I characterize it? We had a customer come to us who was very concerned about this. We took the same tool that I was talking about that generates our SBOM. It looks at the CVSS. It can identify this CALIC issue. It finds 2,000 invocations in the customer's product. That's a lot. But we were able to script to go into the code. We're looking at the binaries. We're looking at all the executables. We can look at if functions are fortified for the input variables. And so we said, you know, let's say one of those variables is 1. I'm going to allocate 1 of this object. Now we went from 2,000 to, I think it was less than 30. I can hand inspect 30 locations. I can't hand inspect those others. So it was able to take what had a high CVSS score, look at it and see, oh my gosh, this is insurmountable, and bring it down to something manageable that we could hand inspect and explain so that the customer could move forward. So sometimes you need to use those tools or think outside the box to say it's really not a problem.
Yeah, and I think a part of this relates to the FDA guidelines. There are some aspects saying these are security requirements you should have, but a large part around the software development and the risk assessment is about the process you have in place in your development. It's not saying, oh, you have to use these exact specific methods, but it's really the overall process to make sure you have a holistic process addressing all the phases from your initial development to what are you going to do as an organization after deployment to be able to continually monitoring. What are the processes put in place for how to address that? So it's less prescriptive on individual techniques, and it's more about making sure you have a mature cybersecurity culture within your organization and the processes to back that up.
For the value perspective, so what we see is mature safety processes, not vulnerability processes in medical space, right? So we all need to work towards that. And then we have people who are here, for example, and yourself who deal with multiple verticals who are a lot more advanced in cybersecurity, so you can bring that expertise to you, right, to healthcare in helping you establish a proper vulnerability process and figuring out which one you need to select and how do you do the scanning and report and all of that. And how to design, right, so that you don't run into that many issues later.
One of the things that probably a lot of cybersecurity professionals in the room have dealt with is the PTCX Zeta. which had a CVS score of 9.8, right? And so I think that they had, I think something that you guys had talked about, the hard-coded credentials, right? So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that case, the PTC Exito, ineffective technical holder.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, well, I guess my other question was like, how about in terms of latency, like, because I know that with FHIR, latency is kind of an issue, or is this kind of something that is being dealt with, or is being
Latency in terms of a response across a network, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are features that you can deploy, and certainly we use Black Channel, which when we want to send data, that's why I consider the network the Wild West. It's a don't care. When I hit it, I'm not concerned. I'm concerned with the data getting through, and so I'll use basically putting an envelope around my data structures that I'm sending across the network. So when it gets to the other side, sort of like TCP, you're gonna see, was it received in order, and was it received in time? And so if it wasn't received in time, I can flag that and say, okay, something's going on in my network. I'm not hitting my minimum. So I need to either throw the data away or say this data is tainted. But the ability to do that and to say I might be running across a wireless network, maybe I'm running across a wired, maybe it's a different kind of wire, a different technology or topology. Just making sure that I've got to that other end in time and that it's authentic.
And then if you need higher resolution than just one pipe across, that's where DDS comes in and DDS Secure comes in, right? So now you think about that pipe, breaking it into smaller chunks, right? So you get more control, right? So as you're going and you can set up different policies for authentication, for encryption, for how the data is actually transmitted, right? So as you get to have a little bit more control over the Wild Wide West as the data flows, right? And then use the tools to monitor what that assessment is going on, if there's things you need to learn and adapt to it, right? Things of that nature. And also visualize all the discovery and things that can bring your system down, hide them if needed be, obfuscate the data, how you design your data is also important, right? So instead of a string, put a bit mask, right? Things like that are useful, right? So it really is from the data definition and the flow, right? If you really want to take control, and then you can deploy that application both on shared memory and then over, let's say, a UDP socket if you wanted to send it out, right? As long as you have some control. And then if you go further to a disadvantaged network, right, then you need more of an observability framework to actually look at your entire fleet kind of system, right? So we can help you with that as well. So it's where you can go and monitor your multiple publisher subscribers and different devices everywhere and see how it's behaving and what's happening in your system. Right? So there are layers here that you can use.
And I would say in general, when you're adding in, or when you have authentication and encryption, it takes compute cycles. It's going to add some level of latency, whether it's a secure communication channel, or it's your encrypted file system that you need to encrypt and decrypt as you're accessing it. It will add latency. One of the areas in many of those cases, though, that you can look for opportunities where you can use the hardware accelerators that are in the processor, which are there to make it much more efficient. So if you're doing an encrypted file system without a hardware accelerator, you're going to have a big latency impact. If your solution is using that hardware accelerator, you can get it with very little impact, a very low overhead capabilities that you have for facilitating that. So, but it's still not zero. You don't get it for free. It will cost a little time to be able to implement that. Is it worth it? Yes, I think so, but it's something you have to factor into your design. And this is where you see the challenge of systems where you have a legacy system that you're trying to add security into, and you run into these challenges of, well, we didn't have enough compute cycles to handle the latency. We didn't have enough memory to add the algorithms and the keys needed for the authentication. That's why kind of adding security to old designs is a really hard problem to have. And so it's better to make sure you're designing it with the security up front. And I think that's one of the big things the FDA is trying to push for. Security should be part of your original design spec, thought of from the very beginning, so you can account for things like the latency of encryption authentication that you need.
My questions pertains to dynamic analysis, input fuzzing, and malformed data testing. I know all the panelists addressed static analysis, but only Roman addressed this topic. Specifically, I would like to know how often is this type of testing requested, provided, and supported for diverse medical devices, as it's a little more advanced of a topic?
In many cases here where you're looking at fuzz testing or penetration testing, it would typically be done, your product has to be far enough along to be close to the final product before you can really do some of that testing. Especially penetration testing, you need a kind of a near production ready device to do that. That's the goal of penetration testing, is really to look for areas your design team, the unknown areas that you haven't identified, that you can have a third party or an independent person or a separate internal team that can do that testing to look for vulnerabilities that you may not have known about. And so that's often done as part of that design, the development phases. What happens after deployment is usually doing penetration testing repeatedly is often not typically done just pre-deployment, not post-deployment. What you find later afterwards is more about looking for vulnerabilities you haven't discovered, new attacks, new methods to be able to analyze that. So it's often something that would be done during the design development phases of the system. The challenge you get into there is as you start to do more and more software over-the-air updates, is your software is changing, and how do you then keep doing some level of testing for each firmware update to ensure you haven't introduced new vulnerabilities as part of that process. That's not like a full-blown, let's send it to a pen tester for 2 months to do that. But some level of testing I think would be good to ensure that's part of that process for any firmware updates. And it should be proportional to the extent of the firmware update that you were doing. If it's adding in large new features, that's more important than I just needed to update a library from one version to the next because a vulnerability was determined. That may not require any additional testing. So it's really then be proportional, post-deployment proportional to the updates that you're doing.
I'll add real quick that normally I do, like the fizz-buzz testing would be part of the verification testing. It kind of included as that, and penetration testing around that same time. You want to do it early enough that you can respond to any defects, but late enough that that it incorporates all the security controls, that it's a mature product. So verification testing is usually around that sweet spot where you're able to patch some of that. And usually what happens with penetration testing is you send it off, they'll give you a report, you fix it, and then send them a new build with the an update that they can then test to make sure that you have in fact closed those gaps. And lastly, one of our clients recently took the position that he plans to do a full penetration testing on an annual basis. It was the first time I heard about it, but it's a major company that's going to do that on their devices as part of their routine. But usually you want to do it before your submission to the FDA.
As a consumer, as the world, leave us on an optimistic note. I mean, the cyber, there's a lot of things coming down from the FDA and the EU and so forth. I mean, they're putting these in place for protection, right, and for good reasons. But why don't you leave us on a note in terms of there's a lot of threats out there, but from what you see and from the technologies that you help to enable, leave us on a positive note.
I'm reminded of Roman's slide where the number one thing was hacking into a cardiac pacemaker. But I think that that's like the FDA's worst fear. So I think that these regulations are in place because of that. The FDA is very concerned about that. And I think that as much as we hate the regulations, they're ultimately going to be good for consumers in the industry.
When I look at the industry, I see, like 5 years ago, a don't care. And I think the industry is waking up. And some of this is regulation coming down. Okay, you have to do this. So all right, we're going to go ahead and embrace it. The other thing is it's not just about the medical device. You're looking at the hardware manufacturers. They're providing things that used to not be in hardware. Now you have the trusted execution environments. Those are there. Take advantage of them. If you're not taking advantage of them, then you're probably not fulfilling the entire needs. And maybe that's okay today, but tomorrow, have you put it into your life cycle? So I see that the hardware manufacturers are adding these capabilities in. The software providers have these capabilities. And so since you have these building blocks, it's just a matter of putting them together in the right order and executing.
So from my perspective, for our perspective for RTI it's really positive. As Stephen said, nobody cared a few years ago, but all of our customers, majority of them, especially bigger customers, all the new projects, they're thinking about security right from the design, right? How to actually use DDS Secure, how to make sure they have a proper flash availability process. Some of them are actually doing more than what the FDA is mandating, right? They already are planning to do more. So that's actually really positive, right? So it just needs to become more cost effective, and one of them is a lot of the hardware support now available making it more cost effective. What you used to spend $2,000 for is $200 chip parts now, right? $50, it's really come down. So it's making it really affordable for a lot of companies and devices to really follow this process properly. So that's really positive.
And I would say the big positive is the fact that we're all here today as a community thinking about cybersecurity. There's a lot of passion around people making sure their devices are secure. The technology is needed to do that, making sure the development processes are doing that. So I think that community coming together to look at security and saying, this isn't something that we can't do. This is something we actually can do and we will do. And there's a lot of passionate people behind that. And I think that, for me, gives me a tremendous amount of hope. It'll be a constant battle. It's a cat and mouse. It's not a one and done. But I think we all realize the challenges, and we're up for it, and we'll come together and do an amazing job.
Again, thank you all very much for coming. Please, keep the conversation coming. Let us know what else you'd like to hear. If you still have questions that were unanswered, you can reach out to us, and we'll get you some answers. And probably lots more to come in the coming months and days ahead in terms of additional conversation on this too.